In the Thunderbolts, we see Bob Reynolds' mental illness handled with care and visualized, and a bunch of folks helping him get through it. In Ant-Man, we see Hank Pym's more or less just alluded to. In his early years as an Avenger, we see Hank Pym dealing with inadequacy, inferiority, as well as mental breakdowns. During one breakdown, we see him strike his wife, Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, but this was revealed by editorial, the writer at the time, Jim Shooter, as an accident. It wasn't supposed to be portrayed like that. But before we can get into that, we gotta look at how Hank Pym got in this position in the first place. As Ant-Man, he's a founding member of the Avengers, but that's not the only identity he had. Hank Pym discovers that the same Pym particles that allows him to shrink also allow him to grow in size as well, so he takes on the identity of Giant Man. He then gets stuck in that form for a while, so he goes by the name of Goliath. Goliath is then killed by this new enemy of the Avengers, calling himself Yellow Jacket. Yellow Jacket attacks the Avengers, he kidnaps Van Dyne as a hostage, they get into a scrap and she goes to slap him, and he kisses her, which is wild work, but then he apologizes not knowing what came over him. She realizes something about Yellow Jacket, then when the Avengers come in to try and save her, she says, hey, everybody stop, I'm gonna marry him. This is comic books, just go with it. The Avengers are like, what the fuck? And when some villains crash their wedding, we see Yellow Jacket now in duress as he sees Janet Van Dyne, his now wife, in stress being attacked by these villains, and we see him trembling in fear before he finally acts, but he acts as Giant Man. Yellow Jacket was Hank Pym all along. Turns out he was working late in the lab one night with some untested gases. He dropped the vials and it got into his head, giving him a huge dose of schizophrenia, and at the time he was thinking of proposing to Janet Van Dyne, which is how we got here. Hank Pym stays in the moniker of Yellow Jacket, and when they go back to being Avengers, we see how his behavior has changed. It's become more flippant, and we see he's a bit more aggressive. Again, not the best portrayal of someone with a mental illness. There's a huge difference between having a mental illness and just being a straight up asshole. And then there's a situation where there's a villain attacking downtown. The Avengers engage, and Captain America is able to talk this villain down for a moment, and then Hank Pym just straight up shoots her in the back! Everybody's like, what the fuck? Things get squared away with the villain, but the Avengers have Hank Pym go on trial amongst themselves. And dude can't even really give the true explanation for his actions, because he was just really eager to prove himself again with the Avengers now that he was back. But he says, I got no explanation for what I did, which gets him court-martialed. They're gonna reconvene in 3 days to hand out their verdict. We see him leave, and Janet Van Dyne tries to comfort him and ask what's going on, and he just like snaps on her, saying, yo, I can't deal with all this shit and you slobbering all over me, which is a wild thing to say. Tigra sees us and is like, I won't let him talk to me like that. And first of all, girl, you're worth like 10 of him, so what the fuck is this? But Hank apologizes. And I forgot to mention that Janet actually saved him from being attacked by that villain he struck in the back as well when she threw a truck at him. Janet blasted the truck and saved Hank, which made him feel inadequate. We then see them leaving the Avengers mansion and everybody asking her for her autograph and not his. They don't even know dude's name. They're calling him Bumblebee. But Janet bigs him up. There's a conversation to be had there about women making themselves smaller in order for a man to feel bigger about himself. And I feel like this is like a really classic case what we're seeing right here. Especially because he's married to Janet Van Dyne now, and she's way more successful than him, richer than him, got the looks and everything like that. But she's not thinking of all that shit because she loves her husband. Meanwhile, that's all he can focus on because he feels inadequate with himself and feels like he's never really doing enough. And he feels like he has to constantly prove himself, which is why he created Ultron in the first place, the first AI in Marvel. And we see Iron Man reflecting on this as well, finding it odd that he chose to stay as Yellow Jacket and not go back to being Ant-Man, and him thinking that was probably because he didn't want to feel inadequate as Ant-Man, which is why he was playing around with Pym particles and became Giant Man. But being Giant Man was a huge strain on him, so being this new identity of Yellow Jacket was like forgetting that past, forgetting how he wasn't strong enough to keep up with like the Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor. And can Hank really get over all his issues that quickly? When he created Ultron, their greatest fucking enemy, he attacked them as Yellow Jacket. He's asking himself, can he ever be more than just a haunted, hollow man constantly seeking to redeem himself in others' eyes? Back at their place, Janet's trying to talk with Hank, and Hank's like just locking himself away in his lab again. Your girl was trying to get it down with Hank, but he was like, no, I'm not really in the mood. I'm gonna go to my lab and do things. And when Janet sees he hasn't come to bed that night, he's still in his lab. She shrinks down and goes inside to make sure he's still okay, and this motherfucker's building a robot. Not just any robot, an adamantium robot, to attack the Avengers so that he can come in and save the day. Dan's like, what the fuck is this? He's like, whoa, you broke in here to spy on me? She's telling him, yo, I came here to check on you, and I see you building a giant robot. Is that adamantium? What the fuck is going on? It's been 3 days, and you've been here doing this shit? It should also be noted that this robot is designed to attack the mental patterns of the Avengers, so he decides to try it out on Jan. And Jan's motto for this entire time is, what the fuck? The robot is damn near indestructible except for this one little spot that Hank Pym hits, and it's going to make him look like the hero when he unleashes it on the Avengers. That way he'll avoid being court-martialed and he'll get his career back. And Janet's telling him, yo, this is a horrible idea. You can't do this. Hank Pym's not hearing her though. He's just going through with his plan. Okay, yeah, the robot will come in, it'll attack us all. I'll take it down. I'll look like the hero. And Janet is trying to tell him, this is not a good idea, and this is where he gets frustrated and slaps her. It's just like Iron Man said, he feels this is his only chance to redeem himself. Hank Pym's like, yo, you don't understand. I can't let them kick me out under these circumstances. And Janet, now hit on the floor, agrees to go along with it. They go back to the Avengers mansion and they're going through with the hearing, and Captain America's like, yo, we could have just looked at this like a mistake that happened. Hell, I almost killed a child by accident in the war. Good thing that kid was ducking. I would have broken with my shield. That's another story. We ain't talking about me. However, what Captain America's talking about here is holding each other responsible, which is why he's pushing for the harshest penalty on Yellow Jacket. They open the floor for Hank to plead for himself, and here he just, my man is, woo! The way this man just basically writes and lays out the Bible for the Kevin Samuels and Andrew Tate, I don't even know dude's name, whatever, for their types right here in his defense for himself. And this man feels like he's got so much sauce as he's saying, yeah, I know it looks crazy, but I'm gonna plead not guilty because my mistake, as Captain America sees it. What I find funny is that Captain America doesn't see the treachery of her enemy. When I shot her from the back, even though she wasn't being hostile, I was saving his life. She could have been setting that man up. But is he grateful? Nah. Why? Because the enemy was a beautiful woman. Did he think I didn't notice the way he was looking at her like she was a Statue of Liberty and he was trying to get a peek under her dress? I saw that shit. It's no wonder he's upset because he actually liked her, even though I saved his life. Ain't that right, Cap? I'm the actual hero here. And that's not just my reaction, that's everybody's reaction across the board. Everyone's like, oh, brother, this guy stinks. Hank Pym pleads with his wife, yo, tell them I'm right. Tell them Captain America's just jealous. And then Janet, Hank Pym's wife, takes off her shades and pleads with her husband to stop. And everyone can see the black eye that she has now. And once everybody sees that evidence clear as day, Hank Pym doesn't calm down. He doesn't check himself. He doesn't realize, oh, I'm well. And that man says, shut up, woman, this is happening now, and he calls for the fucking robot. And that robot comes in whooping everybody's ass, even Hank Pym's ass as well, because it got even more aggressive now that the real Avengers were there. And the person that saved them all was Janet Van Dyne, because she saw what Hank did and hit that same exact spot, which then sends this man into an even deeper spiral down. My man's like, oh, why did it have to be her? Why did it have to be her? Thor's like, that was a dumb plan to begin with. We all saw through it. And I think maybe the wildest part of all this is that Yellow Jacket just stands up and he goes, ah, well, I guess I'll be going now. Nobody said something. Okay, I guess I'll just make my way out. And in the next issue, we see Janet and Hank discussing divorce. And it's here we see the guilt and shame just wash over this man entirely, even more so. Janet's talking to him saying that he can name a settlement. He's like, no, I don't want anything. And he knows it's too late to talk, but now he wants to, even though she wanted to talk way before then, each time. This dude just can't get his words right because he says, oh, I guess I gave you quite a shiner, huh? And she's like, shiner is an interesting word for something that's hurtful and shameful that I gotta bear right now. This shit's humiliating and it makes me sick, and you make me sick. Hank tries to explain that he didn't mean to hit her, he was upset, and she's telling him, nah, you are more than upset. Yo, you're a deeply troubled man. And we see Janet get her shit off here because she's like, yo, for years I hung to you, I clung to you, I propped you up, yo, I worshipped you. Never again. The coldest line right here, she's like, yo, I had Jenkins put your shit in the Mercedes, the blue one. You can take it. Hank tells her, hey, look, man, I don't want anything. I've caused enough harm, right? So he's like, I'll take the car. I'll return it as soon as I can. And we see her a little, not a break, but just like she's concerned because this is a man she loved. And she asks him, like, well, how are you going to get on? He's like, yeah, don't worry about it. I got like some money from the books and the patents. I'll be fine. And then we see Hank Pym in a hotel by himself, like, this is the lowest point maybe he's ever been in his life. Now, it's important to note that after the story, Ant-Man Hank Pym does take accountability for his actions. He does do the work to become a better man. I believe it's years later when him and Janet get back together, even though he was reluctant to. And we see Hank Pym go from someone that, even in real life, his comic books weren't really that, like, stand out. Stan Lee talked about having to make a note to artists to keep in mind, to not just have Ant-Man on the cover, just like, you know, standing like a regular superhero. He shrinks, right? That's what makes him stand out. So you should have him standing next to a matchbook to show how small he is, or a bottle of something to show his stature. But they never really kept that in mind, and it just looks like he's this superhero in a weird costume, not really highlighting his power. And that has been Hank Pym's struggle. He was never the Avenger that saved the day. If anything, he was always the first one knocked out. He does manage to turn things around, and there's a time where Janet Van Dyne is dead, and he rocks the Wasp costume in homage to her. She comes back to life because it's comic books. And then there's when Hank becomes the scientist supreme of Earth. And then during the Avengers Initiative, he's the one instructing these kids that'll become Avengers. But that slap and frustration to Janet Van Dyne has haunted him throughout his comic book career and brought on the stigma of him being a wife beater, which other authors have highlighted. There's even a scene where he's in the Avengers Initiative and he's on a bus introducing himself to the new recruits, and Prodigy, this hero, calls him a wife beater underneath his cough. During an interview in 2011, when referencing that scene where he slaps Janet Van Dyne, Jim Shooter, the writer at the time, talks about how that was actually a mistake. The action that was written down was for Hank Pym to be throwing his hands up in frustration. Artist at the time was Bob Hall, and he learned from John Buscema, and Buscema always taught him that in comics, to make the action big. According to this Reddit post, Bob Hall commented on this and said that at the time he wasn't really a pro. He was a fan with some skill, and he couldn't really draw it the way that Jim wanted. He talked about doing it multiple times and then gave up on it and thought like, okay, well, I can do Marvel action, so I'll just do a Marvel action moment of this. And the result of that is what made him realize, okay, I gotta go off and like straight up know the like fundamentals of drawing. Hall talked about actual guilt, like real legit guilt over ruining this character, and that also making him unusable for future writers. Jim Shooter then talked about how artist Bill Sienkiewicz went up to him and was like, yo, why didn't you get me to draw that? He saw the intent that Jim wanted through the panel of the mistake that was made by Bob Hall. But the damage was done. And Tom Brevoort, a Marvel editor, even talked about it as well, because basically, like, the fans will never forgive Hank Pym. It wasn't supposed to be him being a wife beater. That wasn't supposed to be the story. And no matter what's done to redeem him, it always goes back to that slap moment, and not even the context behind the slap either. And he talked about how most things in comics are fixable, but not that moment. Apparently that moment's like almost set in stone, really. And that's probably because it was like the biggest thing that happened aside from creating Ultron with Hank Pym. But there's also nothing really set in stone, because it also shows how fickle humans and fans can be, because we select and choose who we want to forgive, even if they're real or fictional. I'm going to keep it fictional because if we look at Peter Parker during the Clone Saga, when he realizes that Ben Reilly was the clone and not him, he attacks Ben because he thought he was the clone the entire time, and he's whooping Ben's ass. Mary Jane comes over to try and pull Peter off that, and he backhands her and she goes flying across the room. Keep in mind, she's pregnant. There was a bunch of outrage of that scene, and fans hated it as well, which is probably why we don't really think about that, but that happened, yet Peter doesn't get the same stigma as Hank Pym. And a big difference there is that there weren't a bunch of writers that were kind of enforcing that stereotype with what Peter did like they did with Hank Pym. And when we talk about him trying to be redeemed in Avengers AI number 5 in 2013, it's revealed that he has bipolar disorder. And he created a machine that helps him manage when he has his highs and when he has his lows coming on. And it's a dope real world turn for a look into this character. And I guess maybe it's supposed to redeem his actions that he didn't know what he was suffering with before. However, we saw mental illness as a scapegoat back when he was dealing with those gases, and it gave him induced schizophrenia. The problem with depicting or using mental illness as a scapegoat for a character is it's always usually that extreme case. I'm not saying this as an expert in mental illness. I am a kid that grew up with a single mom that had to deal with a chemical imbalance throughout her entire life. Which is why I say there's actually a thick line between mental illness affecting your behavior and then a character or a person just straight up being an asshole and blaming it on a mental illness. No. You're an asshole! Oh, almost forgot. There's a really great article in Men's Health called The 1981 Mistake That Changed Comics Forever, written by William Goodman back in 2024. And what's dope about the article is they cover the slap between Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne, and to them, that is the catalyst for fridging women in comics. I love their outlook on this because in my eyes, I thought the catalyst for fridging women was the death of Gwen Stacy, because that was something that was beautifully done and never done before in comic books, where the lover's interest dies. And I felt that was the catalyst because folks kept trying to up the ante that way, but it was actually way more violent and more gruesome. So they were getting away from the point of context within Gwen Stacy's death, instead replacing that with shock value. William Goodman points out that Hank Pym slapped Janet Van Dyne in Avengers number 213, November 1st, 1981. 5 months later, April 1982, Elektra's killed over in a Daredevil comic. Not just with the playing card thrown by Bullseye that slit her throat, but her being impaled with her own side. July 1986, the second issue of Watchmen drops, and we see that essay happen between Edward Blake and Sally Jupiter. Same year, Daredevil Born Again drops. Karen Page, she's now addicted to drugs and doing sexual acts sex for them. She's in the pornography business. 1988, Barbara Gordon gets shot by the Joker in The Killing Joke. 1999, Karen Page gets killed by Bullseye over in Daredevil. William Goodman points out that from 1992 to 2008, Wolverine had 3 different love interests, each killed, one assaulted, SA'd, over that 14-year time span. The article is incredible, and this is why I love comic books, because there's this deep dive and you see the ripple effects that one comic can have, one moment can have throughout comics history. And that can be for the better or for the worse. So I'm glad that in the MCU, we see mental health taken entirely differently than we saw in the comic books. It shows progression in the handling of the topic as well as in the handling of the characters.